I'm Dr. Andy Johnson, your host. This is the first in a series of short videos related to helping middle-aged white people understand systemic racism. Now, a disclaimer, I'm not an expert in critical race theory or systemic racism. Disclaimer, I'm a middle-aged white guy trying to come to grips with systemic racism and contribute where I can. I'm just an old literacy professor trying to do my part. I may not get it just right, but I am trying. So in this short video, I'll try to explain some things in ways that help some people better understand. The outcome, keep the big picture in mind. It's to eliminate systemic racism. That's the big picture. It may take more than my lifetime for this outcome to be achieved, but it will be achieved. Whether it's in 20 years, 2 centuries, or 2 millennia, there will be a time when racism is a silly little blip in our human consciousness, an embarrassing asterisk in the story of humanity. However, human beings being human beings, we will, I am sure, figure out some other sorting mechanism to use to create categories and castes and hierarchies. Human beings, you see, have this innate human need, this craving, this addiction to find themselves better than someone else. Some human beings also have another craving, to hoard resources and opportunities while depriving others. These two insatiable cravings, sorting and hoarding, are the basis of systemic racism. Now let's address the racial equality myth. This common myth serves to perpetuate systemic racism. This is the myth of sameness and color blindness as a cure for systemic racism. This is the mythical idea that despite the current cultural and historic context, if we just pretend everything was the same, we can have a colorblind society, and everything will be equal for everybody, and racism will be no more. Poof! Racism gone, just like that. That's the colorblind racism equality myth. Equality comes from equal, meaning the same. The same. But equality does not mean equity. As an example, here's something to think about. If everyone in the cafeteria were served the same quantity of the same soup, this would be caloric equality. However, if in that cafeteria there was a sumo wrestler and an adolescent boy playing football, a gymnast, a 5-year-old child, a 62-year-old literacy professor, and an 88-year-old person, the same caloric intake would be sufficient in some cases and severely lacking in others. Equality does not mean equity. The goal is racial equity. Equity means being fair. Thus, it is recognized that for each to function at his or her highest, each person in the cafeteria would need a different type of meal and different quantities. 1 cup of soup might be equal, but it would not be equitable. Another example, the track meet. Let us imagine that we are at a high school track meet and it's time to run the mile. In this race, a group of runners from Webster High School are made to start the race 200 meters behind the starting line. Even though the conditions were equal at the start of the race and all runners started at the same time, it would be very hard for the runners from Webster High School to catch up to the other runners. For there to be equity, the runners would need to start the race at the same place and the same time. Equality does not mean equity. Equality does not mean equity. Now, systemic racism needs to be understood in the context of history. In the book, An African American and Latinx History of the United States, Paul Ortiz describes how people of color have been enslaved, exploited, and deprived for hundreds of years. They continue to be disadvantaged and restricted by societal systems. These are political, economic, legal, judicial, and educational systems. Now, the idea that we will simply wake up one morning and think that starting today, everything is going to be the same and we'll all be equal and we won't see color is naive to the point of ignorance. As well, it assumes that those in power are going to wake up on that same great getting up morning and willingly give up their power. It's based on the premise that their hearts will suddenly be open, the scales will fall from their eyes, and they'll be willing to start sharing the opportunities and resources that they have so long hoarded for themselves and their kind. They'll share these in an equitable fashion. Racial equity means that where people have been and continue to be disadvantaged and restricted, they might need to be just a little bit advantaged in order for them to catch up, in order to bring them into the system. But that's not fair, comes the deeply felt whine. Fair? Do you mean equitable, unbiased, even-handed, just, impartial? Or do you mean the other kind of fair, with all the rides and games and attractions and fried cheese curds? What's fair? Who decides who gets resources and opportunities and who does not? For example, some schools get more, others less. Some communities get more, others less. Some healthcare systems get more, others less. Some get better jobs, others not so much. Some get better housing, others do not. You can't achieve equity when some groups are starting the race 200 meters behind the starting line and others are 200 meters in front of the starting line. Now imagine, if you would, a third grade student living in poverty who often comes to school without breakfast. This student has to deal with the chronic stress that comes with crime rates and drug abuse, often associated with low SES neighborhoods. This student attends a poorly funded inner city school with few books in the classroom and classroom libraries. Here there are 30 students in an old obsolete classroom who are taught by an unqualified teacher who does not want to be there. Now compare this with another well-fed third grade student living in a wealthy suburb. This student attends a well-funded school with lots of books in the school and classroom library. Here, there are 20 students in a classroom with all the latest technology who are taught by a teacher who had to beat out 300 other candidates to get the job. Even if both third graders were taught using the same curriculum, with all the difference, would you say that there is educational equity here? So let's define our terms. The term racism often conjures up angry white men, usually wearing some sort of silly costume with party hats, marching about, yelling, waving their arms or worse. These great white patriots have only one accomplishment listed on their life's resume. They were born white. Congratulations. Racism must be differentiated from racial acts. A racial act involves one or more persons engaged in discrimination, bigotry, hatred, violence, or personal diminution that is directed against one or more individuals and is based on race. Racist acts are a result of racism, but racism is a bit more widespread and insidious. Wanda Blanchette defines racism as individual, structural, political, economic, and social forces that serve to discriminate against and disadvantage people of color on the basis of their race for the purpose of maintaining white dominance and power. Nora Hyland defines racism as a system supported by discourse, ideology, the legal system, and everyday practice that perpetuates white dominance. Ibram X. Kendi describes racism as being institutional, structural, and systemic. Now, systemic racism has to do with systems, political systems, economic, legal, judicial, and educational systems. It includes the policies, procedures, rules, laws, regulations, traditions, and institutions, and the paradigms that disadvantage people of color while providing advantage to the white privileged majority in terms of opportunities and resources. Systemic racism, whether implicit or explicit, intentional or unintentional, is so enmeshed in the fiber of our society that it often seems normal and goes unnoticed. As such, systemic racism calls for a systemic response. Again, the desired outcome is to reduce and eventually eliminate systemic racism. That's the big picture. This outcome will not be adequately addressed with simply another workshop. There cannot be a single solution from one or two groups. Systemic racism is systemic, system-wide. It calls for a systemic response in which all are involved to change systems and thinking.